Now, and one of the memes you're now hearing, particularly on television, you know what? It's amazing. I've said it many, many times. These people who run these news operations, these so-called news reporters, there's very, very few, a handful who are really, really journalists. The others, they just keep repeating each other, and they repeat these lies or misinformation. Let me give you an example. You've probably heard all day that Lindsey Graham won over 50% in the Republican primary, and he was a major advocate for one of the most radical pieces of comprehensive immigration reform. And he's also loved by Harry Reid. Which cut is that, Mr. Producer? Cut 4. Let's listen to this one. Go.
I believe the Republicans should follow the lead of Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham was part of the Gang of Eight to come up with immigration reform. He never backed down, backed up. He kept going forward on this issue.
Well, it's good that he never backed up because we call that constipation. Go ahead, Mr. Producer.
South Carolina is not known as a very progressive state.
Stop. So there he is smearing South Carolina. Go ahead.
More Republicans who are Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham is a very conservative man.
All right, that's enough. We don't need this man with the onset of early stages of dementia rambling on and as if he's important. I'm using him as a foil. Here's what happened in South Carolina yesterday. You want to know what the voters did? 2 men running in their primaries for the Senate. Tim Scott in a special election and Lindsey Graham. Tim Scott got 90% of the Republican vote. Lindsey Graham got 56.4% for his seat in the Republican vote. Tim Scott had one opponent who got 10%. Lindsey Graham had 6 opponents who got 43.6%. So now Lindsey Graham is the great conqueror. 6 underfunded, unknown candidates, because they couldn't get behind one. They get 43.6% of the vote. Lindsey Graham gets a mere 56.4%. And now Lindsey Graham is the driving force, not Tim Scott, who opposed that statute, who got 90%. I've just told you the story that you haven't heard about the election results in South Carolina. Senator Tim Scott's running in one primary for that Senate seat. Lindsey Graham's running in another Republican primary for his Senate seat. Tim Scott gets 90%. His opponent gets 10%. Tim Scott gets 100,000 more votes than Lindsey Graham in his race. You hear nothing of Tim Scott. Tim Scott opposes this so-called comprehensive immigration reform. Lindsey Graham gets 56.4%, 100,000 less votes than Tim Scott. This is what I mean, folks, about the media, the propaganda, the myth creation. Meanwhile, Harry Reid is the biggest supporter of Lindsey Graham. Well, Lindsey Graham crushed the Tea Party, in other words, conservatives. 6 candidates, all tripping over each other? Nobody dropping out and supporting the other? Mark, why didn't you get involved in that race? There's 435 House races and 32 or 33 Senate races, depending on the year, or 33 or 34. I'm not going to get involved in every race, lose my radio show because nobody wants to listen to it, but I get involved in some of them. But the real story in South Carolina is Tim Scott, solid conservative, opposes amnesty. On the other side of the issue from Lindsey Graham, gets 100,000 more votes in his primary than Lindsey Graham gets. That's the story. That's the news based on facts. But you won't hear it except from me.